I would not hear a debate like this in Germany. It's actually an outrage what's happening in Germany. I have been living there for 35 years. I was a great fan of Germany. In the last 5 years, in my opinion, this country has really gone to the dogs. And the really important person who's sitting on this panel is you, Herr Bittner, because it's the press, my opinion, which is you've diagnosed the situation very well, so I congratulate you. I am a speaker in Germany for a group of parents who are critical about the transgender ideology. We have tried for years to get our point of view into the German press. You have ignored us continually. We cannot get anywhere. The only people in Germany who take a sensible, common sense approach to this issue is the AfD. And because of that, it's like a handicap for our movement as well, because the AfD is regarded as being, or is, that we could discuss, a far-right movement. We don't get anywhere with this. And of course, we could talk about other issues as well. Sorry. And one very last thing about democracy in Germany. As a leftist, I was always told that the final test of democracy was that you could actually get rid of the government. We can't in Germany. The SPD is still in the government. It runs half the government and nobody wants the SPD.
My question is, the Germans were always common sense people. I know, most people know that. And you never tolerated the former, well, what we call right, the National Socialists. But yet you tolerate socialists now without any sense. And they basically rule most of your government now. Secondly, I think it's time that you remind the world that you make the machines that make everybody else's machines. Why is it not so?
I have a question for Ulrike. You said that you were cancelled for taking political views, including the war, protest against the war in Ukraine. What does that actually mean? What did you protest against?
What the panel seem to have described is a process by which the AfD will be suppressed, but there is effectively intellectual bankruptcy within Germany about any solutions to its actual problems. Therefore, will the slow decline of the German economy be the actual solution, in the sense that there will be no revolt, there will merely be a British-style decline into decay?
Hi, my name's Jamie. I'm a student, very interested in Germany. I was in Berlin for the last election. And quick questions. Number one, why does the panel think Angela Merkel ended up being so misguided about Russia from both an energy and security point of view? And secondly, why, it seems to me anyway, why was the state so intent on persecuting the opinions of its own civilians towards immigration, whether it be the lack of confronting the horrendous sexual assaults committed in Köln or criminalizing the speech, such as openly declaring the ethnicities of the men who were sexually assaulting women en masse. And as I say, criminalizing the speech of people who speak out of this more so than the actual offences themselves.
The Weimar Republic was a very poor period of time for Germany. A lot of women and children were prostituting themselves out. And there was a lot of sex trade and quite disgraceful things happening coming out of Berlin. The books that were burned by the brown shirts constitute a lot of this transgenderism and a lot of the kind of filthy pornography stuff. If the National Socialists knew that it was wrong then in the 30s, why have you guys not realised it? Why is it allowed to go full circle?
So my question is about the assumptions around the German character. The panelists have raised the question of the German character, but what does that mean in terms of new citizens and questions of integration? So people spoke about the strong assumptions around the rule of law and consensus, and Joachim's important point around Enlightenment principles and reasons, and that involves questions of integrating people. That one of the reasons they may have come to Germany is the very fact that they mistrust politics in their own country, and that hasn't been a politics of consensus, but conflict. So what realization is of the need to integrate new German citizens who perhaps are as concerned about questions of lawlessness as existing.
I think I saw some polling somewhere once that 1 in 5 German citizens of Turkish origin
supported the AfD on migration. But right, so
My question is slightly provocative question. Can a revolt happen until Germany comes to a reckoning, finds a cure for this great, what I might call, like what many others have called, a collective psychological illness of self-loathing? Will the German self-loathing ever resolve itself? Is it already happening, perhaps? I mean, I might argue I'm seeing the first signs of it. Perhaps it's just a more distilled form of what we see in the West, at least amongst leftist or centrist elites, however you want to describe them. But is Germany doing this? Will it do it? Is it necessary for a true revolt of whatever sort?
The recent gender legislation in Germany, could one of you take us through that and just tell us what sort of, if any, debate took place and how it went?
Mr. Bittner, I actually really like what you said. I think you should start with an apology for what happened. I think that would be a first step to regain the media's for you to for people to start trusting you again. That's the first thing. And then I was wondering, to your point that the revolt will not happen, do you think that the Germans, and it goes to your point a little bit, the self-loathing, are a little bit afraid of their own shadow, and that's why it's not happening? And then, is there a danger if it gets bad enough, there will be an overreaction like we had before? I don't know. Do you see that happening?
Hi there, you're right. I'm a reporter with the Epoch Times, and I've reported extensively on Germany's automobile industry, which is suffering because of one. There's going to be a ban on the traditional combustion engine by 2035. And also there seems to be a flooding of cheap electric vehicles in. I'm just interested in the panel, got any views on how does the German public think about this a lot? It's a major employer in Germany. Germans are known for making amazing cars. And I just wonder if this is kind of affecting voters and if that's something that's really in the public psyche at the moment. And if they do think it might be the end of German car industry as we know it.
okay, I'm going to bring the panel back quickly to come back on some points. So start thinking about putting your hand up very, very soon. I'm going to take Jochen first, but my first rule as a reporter is never apologize.
Well, I can't apologize for an institution. You would have to ask other people to do this. What I would say that maybe I've not given my best. I had a section within the Zeit newspaper called Streit, or controversy or debate, for 5 years, in which we tried to do exactly that. Enhance debate, take on the critical questions and not leave them to the populists. That in my credit. But you are right about the general state of German media. I give you that, absolutely. I would like to, if I may, pick up on the question that you raised, the gentleman here in the front row, about not being able to push through with your topics because you were regarded as too close to the AfD. Because this question alludes to the elephant in the room that we haven't talked about yet, which is in German the so-called Brandmauer, or in English the firewall towards the AfD, which means that there's a broad political and societal consensus that you should never cooperate with the AfD. And you called it self-loathing, maybe, as a German, particularly German streak. I think what you need to understand, first of all, about the AfD, we are not talking about a party like Reform. The AfD is partly extremist. You have people like Björn Höcke in East Germany clearly employing Nazi language, trying to attract extremists, and there's too little effort to distance themselves from this part of the movement. That being said, the Brandmauer thought was also created a kind of intellectual firewall, and I guess that's what you are saying. And I had, for instance, local politicians talking to me from the German Social Democrats, telling me that, well, we have a truck problem in our park, we have a crime problem in our local park, but I won't raise the issue in our council meeting because the AfD have already taken that on. The same goes went for nuclear energy. Same was true for immigration. You mentioned transgender. Of course, it was a major mistake, but there is this very strong, and I'll stop in a second, but there's this very strong narrative within the German left in particular that if you engage with topics that the AfD has raised, you actually strengthen the far right, which of course is complete nonsense, because what issues did Angela Merkel take on or raise during her chancellorship that made the AfD strong? None. So it's a very counterfactual narrative, but it's very strong within the German left.
There was a lot of questions, so I'm just picking some thoughts. First, I think you said that a discussion like this could not take place in Germany. And yes, I think it could not. I agree. Starting with the fact that probably Jochen Bittner would not be allowed to discuss with me in public in Germany because I'm inflicted with what we call contact guilt. So you better show up with me.
I would discuss with you anytime in Germany.
Yeah, I take you by the word, yeah, because that is precisely what is happening. Yeah, once you are banned, you are banned. So yeah, I take you by the word. Let's discuss openly in the house of die Zeit. I would like to see this in Berlin happening. Yeah? That would be melting down many things. Yeah. And I agree, if the Zeit wasn't picking up on transgender, the Zeit and none of the other journals is not picking up on disruption of the university. I think a liberal journal like the Zeit should be the most, best journal to place disrupting 60 professorships and making a case out of it. Yeah, but they are basically silencing it all. Yeah, so. Then there was the question about me being cancelled. I wasn't cancelled. I lost my job, which is still another sanction than being cancelled. And yeah, the formal argument was plagiarism. Yeah, so they found some minor mistakes in an old book, which, you look it up in the internet. So you always found something to push you out, because you cannot make openly the argument that I wrote 2 books which are sort of against mainstream. Yeah, but the thing is that 1 week after I published a book on the Ukraine war, the Endspiel Europa, in which I had a 3rd section, many sources, NATO sources, describing from Maidan to February 22, all the things that were preparing. Basically 1 week after, the University of Bonn distanced openly from me, which is a novelty in German university history, basically saying that the university claims that the university is distancing from me as a faculty member. The statement of the university started with the wording, University of Bonn stands together with Ukraine, which in itself, it's insane, yeah, because in German institutions should not stand neither with the Russians nor with the Ukrainian, at best stand for peace, yeah. But so you can make the argument that this statement of the university was clearly a reaction to the book I published a week before.
Yeah, maybe start as a historian with the point about the Weimar Republic at the back. I'm sorry, but I'm not taking any moral lessons from the Nazis, and there's nothing positive to be said about book burnings. You know that they burned Albert Einstein for being Jewish. They stopped playing Mendelssohn. I mean, for God's sake, this was a general moral crusade against anything that was deemed to be un-German, and that ranged all the way from pornography to science. In terms of the nature of Germanness, so I'm picking up on your question and on the self-loathing bit. I think it's an interesting point. I read the other day a book where there was a story of someone who came to Germany as a migrant. I forget his name now, and he said that he realized that he was German when he went to visit Auschwitz. And basically, you get asked as you come in what language you want your audio guide in, and he said German. So he was given a little sort of lanyard that had a German flag on it, and he felt uncomfortable walking around Auschwitz with that German flag on his lapel, and said that was the moment kind of when he truly realized he'd internalized some of that guilt. And the German president, Steinmeier, I think it was, said quite famously that there cannot be a German identity without Auschwitz, and that there's interesting questions, because what do you do if you've come to Germany as a migrant? Your ancestors weren't there when this history happened. You may have only lived in the country for a few years, and somehow you're supposed to just absorb that as your responsibility, as your shared sense of who you are, basically. And that causes all sorts of issues in a society now that is very multicultural and that doesn't have collective sort of historical roots in the Nazi era, from which so many kind of strands of German identity come. I wouldn't quite subscribe to the self-loathing thing 100% because it comes with a performative kind of veneer, I think, where people kind of say the things that they're supposed to say, they commemorate the things that they're supposed to commemorate, and yet there's a very moralistic way in which Germans argue internationally when any matter of policy or geopolitics comes up. Germans somehow assume quite often that they have the moral high ground on these things, because they from that guilt and from the memory culture comes a sort of sense of pride in that we've dealt with our history, you haven't, the sort of thing, which has always annoyed other politicians. Is not a particularly endearing characteristic. From my East German background, one thing that I found quite interesting is that even Walter Ulbricht, the first leader of the Soviet Union, of East Germany, who was obsessed with the Soviet Union, started lecturing the Soviet Union on how to do communism and socialism. He was saying, well, look at our country, we've got these living standards, brilliant. And the Soviet Union leaders all went, who are you to lecture us? You come from the guilty nation. And that, I think, is a strain that is still there. It's a weird mixture of having that guilt, having that self-loathing, but from that also comes a strange sense of pride in having those qualities. Neither of which, I think, helps Germany make kind of pragmatic geopolitical and also domestic decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken to many German diplomats and officials who are very proud of the fact that Germans will never be patriots. They'll never have a strong view. They'll never assert their national interest because, quote, we learned the lessons of how that goes. So it does become, I think you're right, a very performative, quite actually an attractive ideology that strangely puts you above everybody else, even though you're declaring how terrible you are, Sabine.
Yeah, but I think that attitude is very much an elite attitude. And one of the things that struck me here as we were talking is one of the funny things about Germans, when they talk about their own fellow Germans, is that they're always a bit dismissive about them. They always complain about them. And I see that a little bit in this discussion too, like he was saying, they're too meek to actually do a revolution. Well, Germany actually had quite a lot of revolutions. I mean, talking about Lenin actually thought Germany would be the next country. He was quite disappointed it wasn't in 1940, 1908. Well, let me just finish my point just very quickly. And there was, of course, the revolution, which you know better than I do, and maybe not, but in 1989. I think, and you were mentioning, I think there is much more of a climate of unrest in Germany than we've allowed, than we've admitted in this session till now. You're talking about caste burning. Well, we've got caste burning almost every day in Berlin, but it's the far left doing it. We've just had a complete blackdown for 60 hours of a big part of Berlin, people not having any electricity, a massive left-wing attacks, and we have them on a regular basis. So there are a lot of things happening at the moment. I'm not saying they're good, it's very bad. But I do think that there is, and I do also think we shouldn't underestimate the kind of things people are fighting against in Germany. I mean, Ulrike's alluded to it a little bit. I think she's quite right. But even when you are just indicating you support the AfD, you run the risk of losing your job. So there are threats now that anybody who's in public service, that relates to teachers, to any other, even people who are just employed with the state, that they will be losing their job if they show that they sympathize with the AfD. And sympathizing with the AfD means, as Jochen says, sympathizing with their points, with their issues. It doesn't have to mean that I'm actually a supporter of the party, but I might say something about migration. So the fact that so many people are still supporting the AfD anyway, despite that climate, I do think is a sign of some kind of revolt. And I do think that that's. And talking about the elections in North Rhine-Westphalia, which you also mentioned, there's something people always forget. So they say, yes, this is the people in the East who are voting for the AfD. That's not necessarily true anymore. So we now have elections coming up in the South, in the core industrial area in Baden-Württemberg, and the AfD is very, very close. Second party in the polling, and they're scared. The establishment is scared shitless. They're shitting their pants, to be honest. And in North Rhine-Westphalia, we had that situation that they didn't do, they got about, I think, 15% it was. But people forget to say that they were only candidating in about 60% of the area. And 40%, they could not stand candidates, either because the candidates were banned or because they just don't yet have the structures. But if you see how they increased their votes in the last years, it's actually tremendous. So just to say, I want to insist on my little point. Yes, there is a revolt. I could say something about Merkel and the Ukraine. don't know if I still have time for that, but maybe.
No, leave out the later on.
The question is, historically, from the Japanese War to the First World War, the second one, inclusive Angela Merkel, suffrage in Britain after the Brexit, Germany took a position which was pretty much against Britain. What is astonishing is that what you experience now in Germany is exactly what we experience now in UK. The question to the panel is how Germany is going to work in the future to bring to restore some of the sanity across Europe for change.
So I'm very interested in what you were saying about the kind of elite affectation, this sort of pride in Vergangenheitsbewältigung, this idea that Germany has sort of uniquely educated its people on how to come to terms with their uniquely wicked past. I'm a doctoral student in Frankfurt at the moment, so I interact with a lot of these people, a lot of the sort of liberal elite, we might say. And I'm very struck by how sort of instinctively anti-democratic they are, will seem to me. So I'll be in conversations with them and they will very openly say they want sort of full-scale ban, crackdown on the AfD. And I say, well, this is a party that's clearly in the mainstream, whether we like it or not. And then they say, as you've said, they'll be very quick to say, well, that's easy for you to say in Britain, but we in Germany, we've had bad experiences with this sort of thing. To which I always want to say, well, one other thing Hitler did was, of course, ban political parties. And I often wonder if German education really emphasizes the kind of populist elements of National Socialism at the expense of the anti-democratic and authoritarian elements. Has there been a failure of Vergangenheitsbewältigung in that respect?
I just wanted to bring attention back to the point the lady back there was making before because it wasn't addressed. I'm going to disagree as well with you because I do think there's things that we can learn about what happened right before World War II and the National Socialist. I think that we shouldn't repeat the same mistakes because I don't think that people are inherently evil and just went for that because that's what they wanted the outcome to be. I just think that they got so fed up because they weren't being listened to, right? The economy was awful, prostitution and all that, like those things were happening. It's not a lie. So why are we just putting people in the position to become extremists again is what I'm saying. Because I feel like the way that I think and the things that I believe right now have come to be in the last 5 years. I didn't used to be so fed up with everything, but I feel hopeless sometimes. And I think that's happening to a lot of young people and that needs to be addressed. And there's things that we can learn. We shouldn't ignore what happened.
When you say learn, what do you mean by learn? So book burning, what do we learn from book burning? Do we learn that book burning is bad per se, or is it good when they're burning pornography and bad when they're burning Einstein?
What I'm saying is that obviously people weren't supportive of, for example, transgenderism, and they didn't want it to become mainstream or whatever it is, which we're seeing again. People are trying to resist that in good ways. But what I'm afraid of, if we don't do it in a good way, will people be forced to burn books again, for example?
Yeah. But I mean, just a historical point. Transgenderism was not a thing in the Weimar Republic. There was a big debate about homosexuality and homosexual men and lesbian women dressing in men's clothes or women's clothes. But transgender ideology, as we know it, the denial
it's a little bit different, but there are.
Okay, just for the record.
Basically, the point I wanted to make is whether the liberal establishment in Germany hasn't sort of shot itself in its own foot because of this Brandmauer. Because what we've seen in, for example, Italy or France, right, is that the movements that used to be more akin to the AfD in, for example, aiding and abetting enemies of Europe, Russia, China, and so forth, have, in a sense, moderate a move towards the center or are aiming now at institutional capture of the European Union rather than its abolition. While in Germany, the AfD seems to have only radicalized. And I don't think that's due to internal dynamics of the AfD so much as to that Brandmauer that has basically invited them to radicalize further and further because they were going to be ostracized anyway.
So in January last year, 30,000 farmers did actually revolt and protest in Berlin, and this was over cuts to diesel subsidies that German farmers could use in their tractors. But the thing is, this was part of a wider pan-European movement. We saw farmer protests in France, in Spain, Greece, and of course Brussels, and even here in the UK. One of the main campaigners behind it, I think actually the founder, was No Farmers, No Food, which is an English campaign. Do you think it would take lots of other pan-European movements to stimulate ordinary German people into a proper revolt nationwide?
Nobody forgets about the economics of it, the bread and butter, the food on the table, the roof over the head. So my question to the panel is, inequality breeds populism. Do you think you agree to that in the case of Germany? Thank you.
I was in Germany on holiday just a couple of years back in Dresden, a beautiful place. I was talking to a gentleman in a bar, and he was trying to explain the difference between the East and the West, but all know it's divided after the war. And he said it's very important to remember that in the West, they had a free market economy, while in the East, they had communism. In the West, there was an aspirational middle class. Well, in the East, it was working class. In the West, people could own their own home. In the East, people lived in council state. In the West, people could own their own businesses, works of art, pass it down the family. In the East, people couldn't have nothing. And he said these kind of cultural, economic legacies still have an impact. Could you explain, does that affect itself politically? Are people more resistant to things? Or how does that manifest itself?
I think, is it Sabine? I'm just going to a point that you made about politicians coming through in Germany, which are not of the legacy parties, but you said we're not AfD. And I just wonder where you think they're going to come from, because we have this issue here. We've got a strong and successful Reform Party, which I partly support, but because it's the best option. But any other party, they've just got 5%. So I wondered where you thought those other politicians that would oppose the leftist and legacy parties, and they're not AfD, where you thought they would come from, and what party they might make. Thank you.
I feel as if I'm in Groundhog Day. The last session I was at talked about the rise of the Nazis and how it started through freedom of speech and the Nazi Party being shut down through freedom of speech. But they succeeded because of the physical violent acts. And I'm hearing parallels, which is really worrying. So, yes, I just wanted to reflect that. And my second very vague question is EU. We're part of a European community. Is there any role for the EU community somehow in this? I don't know.
Thank you. Could I just ask the panel to comment on whether they think the federal political structures in Germany act as a brake on revolt?
So, it's you talked about the firewall and that it's a myth that if you discuss certain things, the AfD says that will strengthen the AfD. I think that's how you put it. Here's an idea. Something that really strengthens the right wing, the extreme, is the firewall itself. Have you thought about that, perhaps? Secondly, I've looked up your newspaper just now. You, as far as I can see, have reported zero about what just happened in Berlin to Apollo News. Shame on you. Unless you can convince me that you have actually reported on it, that's terrible. For everyone in this audience, what just happened in Berlin is that everyone here knows Spiked Online, I presume. It's got offices in London. Young people run it. Huh? Same thing in Berlin. Bit right-wing. Max Mannhardt, 23 years old, runs a great thing with lots of debate. The left-wing party, together with the Antifa and a state-run organization that opposes right-wing extremism, organized a meeting in Berlin to step on the toes of Apollo News in their offices, where they are in Treptow, to make their life uncomfortable, calling for violence against the AfD, a blatant assault on press freedom. The NZZ, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, reported on it, a much better paper than yours. It's a Swiss paper that has to do this. I'm very angry with you, and I don't believe that you would actually debate Ulrike Gero in Germany, because you might lose your job. Okay. And I'll bet you 100 that you won't.
Yes, sorry, I just wanted to pull up something from what Daniela said earlier. I couldn't let this go. Fact check that Germany actually did have transgenderism in the way that existed with Magnus Hirschfeld from the Institute of Sexuality. They performed genital transition surgery. They prescribed hormone therapy. They instituted gender fluidity. So all of these things were in existence, as was mentioned previously. I do just want to kind of highlight the point that was made earlier, in that I do think that there is a risk that, I think it's the same in Germany and across the West, that if there aren't robust responses to things like the scourge of transgender ideology, mass migration, if this is not tackled by people who respect liberty, democracy, the rule of law, the risk is that people are going to become so fed up that they will turn to the most extreme solutions, because they'll go, well, you're not fixing the problem, so we need somebody who's going to do. And that's why the Nazis rose in Germany at the time. We need moderate parties. We need people who actually believe in not being authoritarian dictators to tackle these problems. So I said, I just wanted to fact check on that and add to Daniel's point there.
Being German myself, I think it is inaccurate to say that Germany as a whole moved to the left or has even become socialist in recent years, because social inequality is still on the rise. And there have been these cultural issues like transgender, like LGBTQ rights, where, of course, there has been some movement which you might perceive as leftward. But overall, I think regarding socialism, government expenditure has increased, because that's the only thing bureaucrats can agree on, expanding bureaucracy. But I don't think that it's necessarily a move to the left in many ways. And I wanted to ask, because I think what has been... I think Germany was rather shaped by stagnation in recent years. And especially under Angela Merkel, just not much progress have been made on any fronts. So I wanted to ask the panel to what extent this is just ingrained in our political system. Because maybe if I can just explain it very briefly, we have two chambers of parliament, the Bundestag for the national level, and then the Bundesrat, which is representative of all the 16 state governments. And these states are all ruled by coalitions of all major parties except for AfD, which allows AfD to take this role as the only major opposition party. I see the red card there, so probably I should listen. No, Carol. Okay. So, for example, during the pandemic, this has been a very interesting case. In the United States, you had the Democrats and the Republicans. It's also a federal system, but you actually had different policies in the 16 states. So, for example, Ron DeSantis in Florida would have a more open policy than maybe what's his name, Californian governor Gary Newsom in California. Whereas in Germany, all 16 states did more or less the same, except for small details, because they were all entangled in the same coalition somehow of the same parties, and AfD took the only really different approach to the pandemic, opposing lockdowns, opposing mandates. So I'm wondering whether we need to change our political system to get anything moving in any direction. I'm not sure whether a two-party solution would be better, whether we need more direct democracy, whatever it is, but just whether we need to change the system.
I'm just struck in this debate how much is similar between Britain and Germany. If you take the topics mass migration, deindustrialization in opposition to net zero, that's where there's clearly things going wrong in Germany. If they get labelled as AfD topics, they are the topics of ordinary working people in Britain and in Germany. And if you try and make them taboo and suppress discussion of them, that's where everything seriously unravels. So I feel that's the most important thing that's required. And certainly we in Britain have had this. I mean, people will remember the election when Gordon Brown was there, and there was a woman called Gillian Duffy who asked him a question about mass migration and its impact on Britain, and he left his mic on, and it was picked up, calling her a bigot. Do people remember that? That's exactly the same thing. If you raise those topics, you get labelled AfD, you get labelled a bigot, you get labelled racist, all of those things. I mean, just in ordinary life, as in my case, as a lecturer in nursing in a British university, arguing for the importance of us training our own NHS nurses and not relying on imports of nurses from the EU or now much further afield, and what that was doing negatively to other countries. I found it very difficult to raise that topic without being called a racist for just mentioning it. Whereas I think the racist thing is to take the staff of Zimbabwe or whatever the other country might be that needs them, much more urgently, or certainly as urgently.
Well, I think actually in Germany things are a bit worse than has been described so far, but it's at the same time quite amusing. So, particularly, let's say, militarism. Militarism is really on the rise in Germany, and the media, which have been so dogged by prohibitions and so on, really present a lot of propaganda on the importance of war against Russia, on people joining the army, etc. So that's one side of the story. But the other side is the government is incredibly defensive. And I think this really has to kind of be addressed. The government really changes its position almost from one day to the next. And it's incredibly defensive on most issues. And this, I think, is really important to understand. Germany is in a very critical situation, I'd say, more than perhaps has been realized here.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, we're going to start the summing up. We're going to do it the other way around from how we did it in the beginning.
Just briefly, I really don't see any point in discussing the book burnings as some sort of expression of free speech. They are the opposite of that. We're at a festival where we're saying that people should write and say what they want to write and say. It cannot be in any circumstances right to burn books. I'm sorry that it just isn't. And I feel in the justification of that, there's a bit of a conflation between the Nazi Party and the sort of ideologues there and the broad support that they did enjoy for a while from the German public. That's exactly the same as confusing the kind of most extreme members of the AfD with all of their voters. It's just not the case that you got 20 to 25% of the German public subscribing to every word that somebody like Björn Höcke says. And in that conflation, I think is where part of the unwillingness to respond to these concerns comes from, and that's as wrong, I think, with the Nazis in the public and the public in the Weimar Republic as it is today. I think that conflation isn't helpful. Second point on the East German question that somebody asked, I think that's a really, really interesting question, because to me, Germans have for a long time, particularly the public, kind of used that as an excuse to not do anything about people's concerns. They've sort of said the AfD is an Eastern problem. It's just weird East Germans not understanding how democracy works. Let's just ignore them. We will deal with that. And I've argued, others have done the same thing, but I've argued for a long time, coming from the East myself, that actually East Germany is more representative of what's going on in Europe overall. They got very similar voting results to Austria, for example, to France, even to the UK now. If you look at polling here, the polling figures mirror what's happening in East Germany. And it's actually the West German public that's the anomaly, because what I said earlier about the wealth shielding people from a lot of the issues, and also the fact that there was an absolute certainty that the system that was established in 1949 is correct, is as good as it is. We don't need to perform it. And I think that's made people stick with the traditional parties for much longer. They've had very good experiences with the Conservatives in building wealth and having the economic miracle in the 50s and 60s. Then the SPD coming in, doing the very necessary social reforms that were going on under Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt. So both these parties for 40 years have done good things for the West German public. And so people are, I think, much more willing to stick with that. Whilst East Germans, and they've had Helmut Kohl basically over-promising, I think, in 1990. For good reason, I can see why he was doing that in 1990, but he did over-promise, saying that there wouldn't be unemployment, and then a fifth of the East German workers were unemployed, those kinds of things. So there's more skepticism towards the political establishment, and I think in that respect, they're closer to what we see elsewhere. So in a way, they're always the canary in the coal mine when it comes to Germany. I think what you'll see in East Germany, you'll see across Germany, I think. In short order. And then lastly, just Sabine, to respond to your point, I wasn't saying that there's never any up, because I know Lenin kind of implied that that's not quite where it was going. It was just hard to squeeze into the 7 minutes. I think what needs to happen, though, in Germany is it needs to get quite bad for people to kind of go out. I mean, even if you take East Germany, there was an uprising in 1953 because of the absolute shortage of things. People were working 16, 17 hours. And we're still not being able to buy anything. And then you add the dictatorship and all of this stuff on top of it. And that was enough to create an uprising. And then there was very little up until 1989, when there was wider changes kind of going on across Europe. Or even take West Germany, basically. You had almost nothing up until the 1980s when you get these mass demonstrations, because people are really, really fearsome of the Cold War escalation. And you get that peace movement that conflated sort of nuclear energy with nuclear weapons, getting the biggest demonstrations that Germany saw in its post-war era. Or 1919, the absolute shortages after the First World War. 1918, the German Revolution, then got rid of getting rid of the Kaiser. But it has to get quite bad, I would say. I think the French public, for example, I think is much, much more likely to respond to things. You just have to say you want to raise the pension age to like 52. And Ari, the French up in arms, I don't necessarily think. I think the same is true for Britain to some degree. I think there's a love for stability, for order, for consensus there that goes quite a long way to shield people, I think, from the type of externalized anger. I think people are more quick to grumble than they are to actually go on the streets and do something about it.
Yeah, and being civic and voting and debating is pretty good. Jochen.
Yeah, it seems I have invited a bit of Zeit bashing, which is all right. I will not duck the question from the gentleman, but I have to say that one of the big joys of being a UK correspondent is that you don't have to follow German newspapers so closely any longer, including your own. But if it's true what you say, and we haven't reported on the Apollo thing, I will certainly get back to the newsroom with that. So thanks for the hint. But what I will say, in my capacity as a Zeit journalist, I don't care in the slightest if journalists from an outlet to the right or to the left of us are intimidated. If free press is under pressure, we should all stand behind the colleagues in solidarity. That's my statement. And I would like to pick on the question from the lady over there. Has the liberal left shot itself in the knee with the firewall, with the Brandmauer? I should think the left, especially the SPD, they actually keep on machine gunning their knees with this firewall, because it appears that, I mean, you have to know that the SPD have been losing half their votes in the past 20 years in general elections. So they went down from 32% under Schröder to a meager 16% now. And of course, one of the reasons is that with this firewall comes a very convenient intellectual laziness, because the SPD knows that in the coalition settings that we have in Germany, the Social Democrats will be needed anyway. So why make up your mind and dwell on your mistakes and look for a better way? And as somebody asked for the differences between Germany and Britain, I think here's an important one, which also alludes to this point. Here in Britain, your electoral system, the first past the post system, provides for a psychological urgency with every member of parliament to actually adapt to new circumstances, because they know their seats will be lost unless they gain a majority in the next election. Now, due to the German proportional voting system, that's not quite the case. They don't feel the sense of urgency. So this is, I think, one of the main reasons why we see much more adaptation and picking up on, let's say, issues to the right of Labour by the Starbuck government now than we see with the SPD. So yes, there's complacency on the part of the German left, which is quite suicidal. Right, Ulrike?
Yeah, perhaps just picking up on all these questions, which were basically into Vergangenheitsbewältigung and what is the thing in Germany. I would just answer sort of history is not repeating. I think that's not what is happening. History is not repeating. There is this quotation from the Italian Zilone, who once said, "If fascism is coming back, it won't come back in boots. It comes back in a suit." And this is what is happening.
The sort of liberal middle, Jochen still belongs to, or let's say the Zeit still belongs to, sees the evil in the AfD and especially Björn Höcke, and so there's the right, and that's history repeating. I would argue history is not repeating, but what is happening is that the liberal middle is basically inventing what you call in political science post-ideological totalitarianism. And this is ruled through bureaucracy and through regulation. And that's all about LGBTQ and about migration and about climate. And it comes sort of underneath the surface of ideological battles, because it's only through regulation that you need to control CO2 or do this and that. And it's a bureaucratic sort of Yanis Varoufakis calls it tech feudalism, yeah? And obviously there was this question in the room, is populism, has it to do with income, with inequality? Yes, that is what it is. I mean, I see in the whole process is what we never talk about, a clear refeudalization of the system, a clear oligarchization of the system. It's tech feudalism, if you want so. And to deviate the discussion that the evil is on the right, you invent the AfD as evil, but the real danger is, I go with Varoufakis, is tech feudalism. And it's all this system of bureaucracy that regulates on climate, that regulates on LGBTQ, that regulates on X and Y and Z, and that basically is oppressing the people, if we want to have that sort of old Marxist sort of wording in the room, yeah? And therefore I see there's a huge deviation in the analysis of Germany. And if we talk Vergangenheitsbewertung in the past, and yes, the evil of the past, I think the real problem is the blind spot that we are so focused on the past that we can't even see that the new risk is coming from a quite different side. And I agree with Katja on all this. The especially sort of blind spots are in West Germany. I'm from West German, but because the West Germans have been educated for so long in, we have the best democracy, we do it all good, we have the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, blah, 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 blah. They cannot even get the feeling that they might get it right, might get it wrong. That is the biggest problem, because the East-West divide is really clear. If you travel to the East, you travel to the West, the self-confidence of the Western part that they can't get it wrong, and that they are, in the not repeating the history of the past, not seeing the dangers of tomorrow, I think is the biggest problem of Germany. So we need to get the analytics ready. And I repeat, it's much about post-ideological totalitarianism, and it's much about tech feudalism, and it's much about class division, yeah? And the rest is the invention of enemies, how I would call it. You invent an external enemy, that's Putin. You invent an internal enemy, that's the AfD. And then you have the right to make an authoritarian closure, because you defend democracy and you defend freedom.
I just quickly have to defend Jochen Bittner very quickly, because I went to a party last week in Berlin and I met another Zeit editor, and I said, I met you. And the Zeit editor said, oh, poor Jochen, he's always defending freedom. Just to let you know. There's another thing about the transgender, because it came up. There's a session tomorrow. Germany has one of the strictest transgender laws, by the way, and it was one of the great disappointments we had, that the new government, which promised to do away with it, actually kept it, showing the cowardice of this government. So and there is a conference which I'll be going to in 2 weeks in Germany, organized by some very brave women fighting against this transgender law. Again, a sign that there is resistance in Germany, with some quite prominent women there. It's called the Heroica, just to let you know that. The excellent point about the 30,000 farmers, I'd actually forgotten about them. I was there too. And I think the point about this pan-European thing, I think is really important. So the populism is, and it's no coincidence that people are saying it's so similar to Britain and Germany. There is this international movement, and I sometimes like to compare it. I know it's not 100% comparable, but I do like to compare it with the kind of 1980s revolt in the former Stalinist East, because you had there very national movements like the Solidarność in Poland carrying their red and white flags and inspiring people in the other countries to do the same. And I think that's exactly what's happening. So we can learn from each other. Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the past. Now, I'm somebody who's I really support talking about the past. And I think we must learn from the past. I think we must remember the Holocaust and so on and so forth. Problem is, this thing has always been used in Germany as a whip against the normal people. always by a certain elite trying to distinguish itself from the rest, up to the point that you had people walking around, you still have them, with a button saying, "Dear migrants, don't leave me alone with these Germans." You know, they were German, but, you know, it's this kind of arrogant attitude, and that's how it's been used from the beginning to the end, and I think that's very, very bad. Last question I thought was very important. Where do these politicians come from, which might bring about change? I don't know, but I do know that every politician has to come under democratic pressure, and even the populist politicians will have to. So when they're talking a load of nonsense, they will need to be exposed, they will need to be criticized, and they will be. So Katja is quite right. It doesn't speak for the majority. Actually, his ratings in Thuringia, where he stands, are very, very poor. This very right-wing kind of populist politician. His personal ratings are very poor. The party polls very well, but his own ratings are very poor. And it means we need to really put these populist politicians under pressure. We need to see it as a process, and that's how I see it. And I'm sure there will be new people coming up. I hope so anyway. Thank you.